Welcome to Tentacles and Turtlenecks, where a very dapper sweater-wearing mind flayer teaches you how to keep those heroes entertained for months, while you play the long game of luring them into a trap to devour their brains and claim their magic items for yourself. I'm sure by now that anyone who's spent any time around those adventurers who lack the talent to use magic, or spent any time in a public forum talking about them, have heard that there is some massive power discrepancy between spellcasters like wizards and druids, and the more physically inclined so-called martial heroes like fighters and barbarians. Well, we certainly don't want a world filled with high-powered wizards all wishing us dungeon bosses out of existence, so I'm here to tell you things don't have to be this way. Today's topic is how ability checks are your hero's class features, and how we can use that same logic to help us create even more impressive monsters. It's easy to see why spellcasters are so highly prized. They can walk or fly straight up cliffs or over raging rivers. They can turn to smoke and slip through the cracks in a collapsed mine passage, or blast that passage to bits to close it off. They can open sealed doors or hold them shut to halt their pursuers. They can hold their foes in place with grasping vines. They can grant advantage to everyone by spraying sparkling light or paralyzing holds onto monsters, and all for the low cost of some spell slots. Only, spell slots are incredibly valuable, especially the longer an adventure goes. Eventually, those casters begin to get concerned and ration the usage of their spells, and now when they reach that next obstacle, there's nothing left to do but give up and go home, right? What if I told you you could do all of those things without spending a single resource at all? That you could climb straight up that cliff barehanded, or swim across the powerful currents of the river and still survive to reach the far bank? That you could brace and hold up that collapsing tunnel for the whole group to pass under, or knock it down with raw strength? That you could batter through those sealed doors or brace against the oncoming hordes of monsters with brute force? That you can pin in place or knock down for advantage those same enemies. And not only can you do all of those things without a single spell slot, but you can do them all using only a single skill. That's exactly what a strength athletics check does, and every martial class has access to it at level 1, while the wizard is busy taking proficiency in lore, like history or nature. The barbarian is working out so hard they can replicate spells with muscle, and that's not an exaggeration. Now sure, even that scrawny wizard could have taken yoga classes in Magic Academy and had that same proficiency from a background feature, but it's pretty unlikely the same wizard has the strength score, muscle to back it up. It is, after all, the combination of proficiency and natural talent that makes fighters, for example, better at feats of heroic strength than their magically adept counterparts. They often have other talents to further increase their success as well, like a battlemaster's maneuvers or a barbarian's rage. Or in the case of the sneakier variety, a rogue's expertise goes a long way to both compensate for low ability or to further amplify a high one through the roof, or at least through a locked door or second-story window. It's so easy to get lost in the mindless cycle of, I swing my sword and that's it, that so many well-trained, battle-hardened warriors seem to forget all the interesting, amazing, and dramatic maneuvers they can pull off with just that one skill. Don't just swing your weapon, throw the enemy off the side of the bridge. Don't shoot an arrow up at the goblin, climb up there and hurl him down at his allies below. Claim that high ground for yourself. Do all those heroic, memorable, straight-up superhuman things the heroes of legend did in the stories you grew up hearing from the bards. It seems strange to me that when we think of what makes a skilled rogue useful to a party, we immediately begin with their ability to sneak around undetected, their talent at opening doors and chests or disarming traps, and their canny knack for getting out of trouble by lying, cheating, and stealing. Those are all ability checks relying on skills they've mastered, and they're great examples of how a class can do those useful, amazing things without the aid of magic. But if we think of rogues that way, isn't it strange that we often don't think of fighters or barbarians the same? And while it's true that they generally lack the expertise of a rogue, they make up for it by having much of their capabilities tied to only a single ability score and skill, strength, and athletics, and by having other features that give them increased chances for success, like Action Surge. The perceived lack of options for how to interact with the world that these types of adventurers suffer from is largely self-inflicted, and a greater focus on how they can use their talents would open up so many doors for them. For exploration purposes, that's a great way to increase teamwork and cooperation within the party. It provides alternatives to having to burn a dozen spells to navigate the wilderness or a dungeon, saving more of those resources for the monsters ahead. This results in the spotlight being shared instead of always being focused on one person. And this can be important for keeping the adventurers interested in the quest they're on, because if they lose interest and give up, you'll never get them to continue on into your lair to deliver those sweet, sweet magical items to you on their defeat. And in battle, it opens up so many new opportunities for big impact, memorable moments. Nobody remembers the 50th time you killed an enemy with your sword, or even a fireball for that matter, but everyone remembers the time that enemy was picked up and hurled off the top of the castle, or had his own statue pushed down on top of him. Ugh, my neck still hurts from that one, actually. Those kinds of moves are just flashier, more exciting, and commonly just as high impact as making an attack could be. These are actions that displace enemies, make meaningful changes to the battlefield's terrain, and often cause a good bit of incidental damage to foes through falling, crushing, or other terrain interactions. They also create situations where a martial warrior may be directly imposing saving throws or opposed ability checks, instead of just attack rolls, which could provide them a much-needed option against incredibly high armor class foes that otherwise doesn't exist in their less exciting default action of attacking. And, if nothing else, it does discourage them from immediately choosing to bash your brains in when they kick in the door to your sanctum, instead buying you just a little more time to monologue while they look the area over for fun things to do. So that's something. But as much as the blame may fall on those martial heroes for not even thinking about using their athletic prowess, an equally large portion of the blame falls on us, the dungeon masters, for not encouraging it. We create the world around them, we fill it with interesting and deadly things, and if we don't place obstacles in their way that they can overcome with their talents, or we don't include incidental things in our encounters that they can interact with, or I'd go so far as to say, if we don't intentionally draw attention to these things, we've really gone out of our way to negate what is effectively the class feature of these martial heroes. It's absolutely on the Dungeon Master to make sure complicated terrain, complex obstacles, and fun interactive objects exist and are all pointed out throughout the adventures we create. When an adventurer tries to do something dramatic with skills, it should be encouraged. When asked if something is possible, don't immediately shut it down for sounding absurd. These are the heroes. They're larger than life, superhuman, the stars of the show we're watching for our sinister amusement. While there will certainly be times it's important and justified to say no, very often it's worth ignoring your gut reaction about believability and instead accept that the unlikely can and does happen all the time in a world full of dragons, fairies, and mind flayers, and instead choose to say yes and focus on what roles are needed. This believability bias is worth calling out in more detail. We don't apply that same logic to spells cast by wizards or clerics. It's magic or the will of the gods. We have no issue suspending disbelief for those things, but when it comes to the over-the-top feats of martial heroes, too many DMs and players alike try to apply the same physical limitations they personally experience to the peak form beings that are adventurers. These aren't just some random run-of-the-mill commoners with swords in hand. We need to think bigger. Look to heroic archetypes like Hercules or Odysseus. Heroes who could do with cleverness and strength of arm what would be impossible for normal people. The heroes are not normal people, and too many a good villain have had our careers ended early by forgetting that. If we can suspend our disbelief for spellcasters, we need to give martial heroes the same benefit. A huge portion of what fuels the perceived discrepancy between spellcasters and martials is our own bias against allowing the, quote, impossible from them. But remember that when creating encounters to tax resources of the adventurers, it's important that the obstacles they face are difficult enough to justify wanting to use spells. We do want them to burn some resources, after all. So when the more physically oriented members of the group do step up, it's important that the challenges have enough at stake. A cost to failure, often in terms of lost hit points or a setback in time putting the adventurers behind. You could also create complex challenges that require more than one roll to determine success, such as 2 related ability checks, or a whole series where they need to win 3 out of 5, for example. For especially complicated ones, you might see spells and abilities used interchangeably, giving the group a chance to work together as a team. Ability checks shift the cost from up front, as with spells, to the tail end and only conditionally on failure. This should sound really appealing to the spellcasters of the group, since it gives the party a chance to overcome those obstacles at no cost at all, saving those precious spells for the enemies and challenges ahead. It might even be worth reminding those spellcasters from time to time of how valuable this really is to them. It's not about a power discrepancy between martials and casters, it's about burden sharing and a team exercise. That wizard is only as effective as he is because of the heavy lifting the fighter is carrying to enable him. And let me just say that as a dungeon boss who has never once received so much as a thank you note from his cannon fodder monstrous minions, those enablers deserve some credit where it's due. It's also worth looking at other options. I don't mean to imply that strength and athletics are the only ways to do great things without magic. The focus on it here has a lot to do with the fact that, as such a broad grab-bag type of skill as athletics is, a huge number of created improvised actions can be tied to it. But the same can be said for many abilities and skills in the hands of an imaginative hero. Acrobatics is another physically focused skill that most magic-free classes have easy access to, and it can also be used to accomplish a lot of dynamic terrain interaction and dangerous but dramatic feats. But forget just physicality, an argument for any skill can be made if the circumstances and creativity of the heroes allow it. Let the heroes use their talents to be, well, heroic. After all, the more success they have, the more loot they'll be bringing to you when it's time for that final confrontation. Now, all this hype around how martial adventurers can perform great feats isn't meant to create the misconception that magic isn't still incredibly powerful. There are certainly many amazing things that magic can do that you simply can't replicate with an ability. There are others that you can replicate, but at a much higher cost in terms of time or resources, such as gold or materials. And as the levels grow, the number of things magic can do that skills cannot also grows with it. At the highest levels, there simply isn't anything in the martial repertoire that can rival the reality-warping power of a spell like Wish. The discrepancy in power is real. It just isn't so nearly pronounced in the first 2 tiers of adventuring where, well, honestly, most adventures take place. But it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison here. Wish is, effectively, the capstone achievement of any wizard, the most powerful thing they will ever achieve. Athletics, on the other hand, is a widely available first-level proficiency. If you compare Wish to any low-level ability, you're going to see the same wild difference in power level. And they only get spells like Wish in the very late stages of their careers, if at all. Few adventurers ever reach the cosmic scale levels where Wish is even a consideration. In contrast, although truly puny in comparison, a martial hero's athletics skill has been around and useful since level 1 and has seen use throughout the entire campaign. Wish itself is a little overplayed, in my opinion. Most spellcasters who ever gain access to such magic are very much afraid of their first use of it being their last, and so the limitless cosmic power of the Wish is more or less relegated to being a glorified extra 7th or 8th level spell slot. and it really sounds a lot less impressive when you look at it that way. Even when used to its full potential, nothing else that a hero can do is treated with the same cursed monkey paw logic as a wish. It's the definition of high risk, high reward. Athletics, on the other hand, may be basic, but it's also reliable for that very reason. Also, by the time adventurers are at such a high level that the wizard can reshape reality, your martial heroes likely have swords that can cut the very fabric of the universe and armor that was forged in the heart of stars, or they frankly wouldn't be standing toe-to-toe with the same threats to all of existence that the wizards are. Keeping those martial heroes feeling heroic does require some extra effort later in the highest tiers of a campaign, where spellcasters can summon cosmic beings, raise the dead, and rewrite existence. But that is something that a DM who is aware of these issues can easily address with magic items and epic boons. And in combat, those things can really show. A skilled fighter with a flame-tongue greatsword and a belt of giant strength can indeed rival or exceed the damage output of any high-level spellcasters, much to the dismay of the vast majority of my former minions. Again, this isn't trying to say that at high levels martial characters are as powerful as spellcasters, and it would be disingenuous to suggest that someone with a pile of magic items wouldn't fare better than someone who doesn't have that same benefit. It's only to offer a suggestion to the dungeon masters out there who might be running their heroes through those higher level threats that if they want the party's martial members to feel as special as they did at those early levels, it might take a little more effort in terms of goodies. Like I said, that power gap is real at those higher levels, and it's important to be aware of it and do what we can to compensate for the enjoyment of everyone involved, if we don't want literally every would-be hero to give up the blade and study at Wish Academy. Alright, I know this has been more of a pep rally for the heroes than any of us would like. I know why all you dungeon masters are really here. It's that bit at the end of the topic, am I right? So let's talk about how this same line of thinking gets us from generic non-threat goblins to the nightmare caves of doom. All creatures have a set of distinctive features neatly plotted out for you in that book most of us evil lords of our lairs own, the Monster Manual. But so often those features are generic, bland, and unexciting. Yes, it's good to know how much damage that monster's attack can cause, but having it bite turn after turn doesn't really get across the ferocity, terror, and danger all that well, now does it? The thing is that all creatures have ability scores, so they should be able to do things with those abilities. Most actions an adventurer can perform, so too can a monster, provided there's any sensible way it might know how. Now, there are times where the Monster Manual gives us a little guidance here, noting bonuses to certain skills like stealth, or giving the creatures special attacks that can also grapple on hit. But outside of that, how skillful the monster is entirely up to us. This isn't even advocating for using our world-shaping talents to revise and alter those monsters in any way. It's just using what is already there, possibly taking some inspiration from the lore sections of each monster's entry. Any creature with sufficient strength can grapple or shove. Any creature with sufficient cunning and speed could hide or ambush. Any creature with enough intelligence can study the adventurers to plan a battle strategy or set traps in their way. Any creature wise enough will take advantage of the natural environment, choose when and where to fight. And any creature charming enough will gather allies or fool the heroes into a trap. Now, none of these talents are necessarily tied directly to any specific ability scores. I use them only to illustrate the point. Just because the Monster Manual doesn't explicitly say that the goblin will sneak around to spy on the party, learn they lack the ability to cure poison, and then set a bunch of poison snake pits and dart traps, doesn't mean that the goblin won't do those things. Just like we need to reset our expectation of martial heroes using their skills beyond hit the enemy, our monsters need to do the same. It's also excellent form to give your big boss monsters some backup in the form of minions, weaker monsters who can add to a combat encounter like you'd add spice to a fresh, juicy brain. But those minions often don't add much more than a few extra hit points to the mix when they're unable to meaningfully participate because they haven't even hit that paladin who's been wailing on the boss. Instead, consider having your minions take advantage of their ability checks. Use athletics to grapple or shove down the heroes, or roll boulders on top of them, use sleight of hand to swipe that wizard's component pouch, use survival to track or set traps for the party, have one constantly taking the search action and making investigation or perception checks to give those sneaky adventurers a hard time by spotting and calling out their location, or even just take the help action to give the real threat, your big boss monster, advantage on its attacks. After all, even the lowliest of minions can serve as a great distraction. And just like the barbarian will have far more fun performing dramatic acts of physical prowess, the whole party will cry with dread or have a great time with these more dynamic and interesting enemies. Use those ability checks and skills more often. They're really fundamental and often overlooked. Thanks again for sitting in this tavern with me, even though it's nowhere near as nice as my lair was. I hope this was useful and can help both adventurer and dungeon master alike. If you enjoyed this, leave a like down with the Tavern Keep, and if you'd like to hear more, subscribe and turn on your notifications. And I know you will, because you remembered to use those intelligence and wisdom-based checks to realize it's a great idea. And if you don't, well, we all know how bad it feels to roll a natural 1.